Many Republican Party officials woke up Wednesday morning wondering if anything could have been done to stop Donald Trump from becoming their nominee. Now, this is the image that haunts the dreams of top officials of the Cruz campaign, a Cruz-Rubio ticket, what might have been. And let me explain why this was to them more than just a dream. Campaign official sources close to Cruz now tell me that Cruz wanted Rubio to be his VP. They even poll tested a Cruz-Rubio ticket in 5 states, including Illinois, Arizona, Wisconsin. The result, according to sources close to Cruz, blowout, the source said. Cruz-Rubio 65%, Trump 35%. Emissaries were sent to feel it out, but Rubio never expressed any interest at all. Joining me now to talk about this and everything else, House Democratic Caucus Chair Xavier Becerra, a Hillary Clinton supporter, former Arizona Governor Jan Brewer, who backs Donald Trump, CNN political commentator Amanda Carpenter, who worked for Ted Cruz, and Nina Turner, who supports Bernie Sanders. Amanda, let me start with you. A source familiar with Marco Rubio's thinking tells me, first of all, there was never any concrete offer. But second of all, some of his misgivings included the fact that, A, he thought that 2 senators from Washington, D.C. teaming up to go after Trump would only feed into Trump's outsider narrative. And B, that he thought that the nominee really should be able to pick who he thinks is going to be a running mate that will help them win in November and not be stuck with somebody picked in the midst of a heated campaign battle in the primaries. Do you think it could have worked, though?
Yeah, I do think it would have worked. I mean, I talked to a lot of people during that time in the run-up to Florida, and there was a lot of excitement for this idea. It would have unified the party. It would have presented a clear alternative to Donald Trump with the Republicans, conservatives, establishment, both wings of the party coming together. It was really a missed opportunity, and there's a lot of frustration. There's people who believe that Rubio thought it was more important to preserve his 2020 option than helping the Republican Party win in 2016 and stop Trump, and I think that's something he's going to have to answer for.
Governor Brewer, obviously a lot of woulda, coulda, shouldas going on right now, but what do you think? Could that, I mean, one of the states they tested was Arizona, and they say that in these polls, Cruz-Rubio as a ticket could have defeated Donald Trump. Obviously, Donald Trump did quite well in Arizona.
He did. He won overwhelmingly, and we're very, very proud of that record. You know, Rubio is a great guy. Ted Cruz is a great guy. We had a huge bench of great candidates. But I think the public has spoken very clearly and loudly that they want somebody that's going to stand up and represent the people. They're angry out there, and they have chosen Donald Trump. In regards to Cruz and Rubio, I don't know if that would have made any difference. And if you want to rely on polls, the polls don't always tell the truth.
It's true. Congressman, how big a challenge do you think, assuming that Hillary Clinton is a nominee, how big a challenge do you think Donald Trump will be to her?
Well, you have to take everyone seriously, but Donald Trump doesn't seem to take himself seriously. So it's hard as hell. I'm not sure where this is going to go. Talking about a Cruz-Rubio combination is like saying that Broncos didn't win the Super Bowl. That's done. Been there, done that. Let's move forward. It's Trump as the nominee. It'll be Clinton, I believe, as the nominee on the Democratic side. We still have a bit of a race. But I don't think it makes any difference to Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton's going to outwork everyone. She's going to earn the votes that she needs. She's already gotten more than 2 million votes than Donald Trump has, and so she's just going to move forward. It's let Donald Trump be Donald Trump and let Hillary Clinton win the White House.
Nina, while we're on the subject of teaming up, do you think whoever the Democratic nominee is should pick the other candidate to be their running mate?
Not necessarily. I mean, I do respect the fact that each nominee has the right to pick their own running mate. But as the congressman said, the race is still up and going. Newsflash, Senator Sanders is still in the race, as much as people don't want to respect the fact that he is in the race and that this is a democracy and it is about choice. I will say about, taking Mr. Trump for granted, there are 2 ways to run unopposed or run like hell. And the Democrats would do well to not take Mr. Trump for granted. He beat 16 other folks in this, and this is going to be a real race.
Now that Donald Trump has locked up the Republican side, the Republican nomination, there's a lot of talk, including by him, about who his vice presidential nominee will be. Take a listen.
The Bushes, the Romneys, the Republican Party has been pretty darn good to them. And they owe a little bit to the party and the people who make up that party beyond their own being above it all. In the case of Paul Ryan, he made a big mistake today, and he needs to understand this.
Speaker Gingrich, former Speaker Gingrich, is obviously one of the people who seems ready to take a call should any come his way. Some of the other people whose names have been bandied about, including, in addition to Gingrich, John Kasich, Mary Fallin, the governor of Oklahoma, Jeff Sessions, first senator to endorse Donald Trump, Rick Scott, the governor of Florida, Joni Ernst, senator from Iowa, Rick Perry, former governor of Texas, Condoleezza Rice, Chris Christie, and Marco Rubio. Do you have a favorite? And what about you?
Who made up that list? They didn't put me on there.
Well, I'm putting you on there. We had you on the show. What about you? What about Jan Brew? Would you be willing to be considered?
Of course, I would be. I would be willing to serve in any capacity that I could be of help with Donald on. But that's a tremendous list of people to choose from. They're all very wonderful people, well qualified. I certainly think that Newt, I've known him for a long time. We all have experienced what he can get done in Washington, D.C. He's been there and done that. And Marco Rubio would be terrific. Mary Fallon would be terrific.
Do you think
They
he needs to
all
pick a
have-
woman, given how bad his numbers are with
I don't
women?
necessarily think that you need to pick a woman. This woman thing has gotten way out of control, I believe, and I think it's been driven by the left because they believe that is going to bring them over the end. But I think people, when they sit down to vote, they vote for the very best candidate. They want somebody that's going to represent them.
I know you're not a big fan of Mr. Trump, but were he to ask your advice, who do you think he should pick?
Well, if you take him at his word, he wants someone who can work with Congress on his behalf. And I don't think he can pick anybody that's a sitting governor or senator or something like that. So I think Gingrich is really his only choice. He's a former speaker, counters the problems that he's having with Paul Ryan. It's also kind of a power move. So I predict it's going to be Newt Gingrich or someone totally unexpected from the lobbying and business community.
Is there anybody that Donald Trump could pick that would make you start worrying more about the electoral math?
Those that might make me worry have already scratched themselves off the list.
Nikki Haley?
Others like that, but you've got some folks on the list who've called Donald Trump a con artist. I don't think he's going to pick as a running mate someone who's called him a con artist.
It's Marco Rubio you're talking about, yeah.
So my sense is that he's going to have to find someone who he's willing to share the stage with, and I don't know if we found who he's willing to share the stage with yet.
That's an interesting
For
point.
me, it would be Governor Kasich, Ohio.
You're a little
Governor
biased.
Kasich,
You're a
just
little
bit,
Ohio
just a little biased.
But I don't think he's thinking strategically like
the
traditionally
governor,
do.
and I certainly,
Disagree.
we disagree, but we have some things that we agree on, especially when it comes to police reform in the state of Ohio. But the governor, no Republican has ever won the White House without winning the great state of Ohio. And on that stage with everybody else, the governor, who is a conservative, came off as more moderate and more the adult in the room. And then I think also Professor Condi Rice. Even though the Iraq war might be a problem, she is an intellectual. She has served. She has been Secretary of State. And in terms of bringing some diversity to that
Yeah.
ticket, he
So
would
Nina,
be.
who walks back what they've said about the other?
Well,
Donald
they're
Trump
all
or
walking
Kasich?
it back.
Yeah,
I mean, they're all
Tulsi will
walking
walk
it
back
back.
saying Bush should be a war criminal.
We believe
Yeah.
in forgiveness. Let it go beyond us, behind us.